Imagine discovering that the people you have been forcing to attend Catholic Mass for 50 years, people you've baptized, people you've meticulously recorded in your parish registries, people who, take communion every single Sunday, are secretly sneaking into hidden mountain caves at night.
Right.
And they're sneaking up there to feed fermented corn beer to their mummified grandparents.
It's an incredible image.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are stepping into the Central Andes during the 16th and 17th centuries. We're going to explore what happens when an unstoppable colonial empire meets a subterranean, unyielding resistance.
Because it really is one of the most profound historical mysteries of the colonial era. I mean, the Spanish Empire declared a massive, sweeping spiritual conquest of the Andean people.
Yeah, that was the official story.
Exactly. The narrative sent back to Europe was one of total victory for the Catholic Church. But the reality on the ground, which we're going to get into, was a grinding, centuries-long underground war of religious attrition.
And the sources we have on the table for you today to unpack this war are just extraordinary. We are pulling from an intricate, highly detailed dossier of colonial and Catholic Church records covering the Central Andes. So that's modern-day Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador.
Right.
We also have cutting-edge modern scholarship on the survival of Andean linguistics. But the absolute crown jewel of our materials today is an incredibly rare 1,200-page indigenous primary source written in the early 1600s.
Which is just unheard of. A text like that fundamentally rewrites our understanding of how the colonized experienced and, documented their own subjugation.
The mission of this deep dive is to show you how indigenous agency actually functioned under extreme suppression, because they didn't just resist on the battlefield.
No, not at all.
They fought back in the realms of language, inside secret rituals, and incredibly, inside the very academic spaces designed to exclude them. We are going to explore how a massive institutional machinery was deployed to erase a culture, and how that exact same machinery was turned completely inside out to preserve it. Okay, let's unpack this.
To genuinely understand this clandestine resistance, we really have to start with the physical reality of the Spanish conquest. The colonizers attempted to drop an inescapable grid over the Andean world.
The literal grid.
A literal grid, yeah. Because the Spanish didn't just sail in and find scattered, unorganized villages. They inherited the highly organized, deeply devoted remnants of the Inca Empire. And the geography of that empire is crucial.
Well, the Andes are not forgiving. We are talking about some of the most extreme vertical terrain on the planet.
And for thousands of years, Andean communities, which were known as islas, survived by mastering that verticality. They used a system scholars sometimes call the vertical archipelago.
The vertical archipelago, so meaning?
Meaning instead of living in one big, dense city, a single extended kinship group would have members dispersed across multiple altitudes.
So one part of your family might be up at, say, 14,000 feet herding alpacas in the freezing grasslands.
Right.
While another branch of the family is down at 10,000 feet growing potatoes and quinoa, and maybe uncles and aunts are all the way down at 6,000 feet cultivating puka leaves or corn.
Exactly, and they shared everything across those altitudes. The Ilu wasn't just a family tree. It was a highly sophisticated ecological survival strategy. But to the Spanish colonial mind, looking at these scattered communities moving up and down the mountains, it looked completely chaotic.
Because they couldn't track them.
Right. It was impossible to tax, it was impossible to police, and harshly for the church, impossible to convert. So in the 1570s, a Spanish colonial official named Viceroy Francisco de Toledo engineered a radical demographic overhaul. It was called the Reducciones.
Which translates directly to reductions.
Reductions, yes.
Yeah.
Toledo's system was designed to violently drag these Andeans out of their high-altitude, dispersed networks and force them into centralized towns. And these towns were built on a strict Spanish grid.
It's like taking the incredibly diverse ecosystem of a wild forest where roots intermingle across vast distances and trying to force all those plants into isolated, identical rows of terracotta pots.
That's a great way to put it.
Sure, the plants are easier to count and they look neat to the gardener, but you are physically starving the root systems.
And the ecological and social shock of this was devastating. Families were severed from their varied food sources, and the architectural anchor of these new artificial grid towns was the Doctrina.
The indigenous parish.
Right, the Doctrina was run by a doctrinero, the parish priest. But if you are picturing a quiet, spiritual shepherd tending to his flock, you need to discard that image entirely.
Yeah, reading through the colonial records in our dossier, the way the Doctrina actually functioned on a Tuesday afternoon is chilling. It feels much less like a religious congregation and much more like a grim company town.
Oh, absolutely.
The local priest is the guy preaching salvation on Sunday, but on Monday, he is essentially the human resources rep for a brutal extraction corporation. He's
Right.
collecting taxes, he's taking inventory of the village's labor pool. There seems to be absolutely zero separation between church and state. Was there any separation at all?
None whatsoever. The Spanish colonial project relied entirely on the absolute fusion of church and state. The doctrinero worked hand in glove with the corregidor, who was the local Spanish magistrate, and the curaca.
The curaca being an indigenous chief, right?
Yes, a traditional indigenous leader that the Spanish had essentially co-opted into middle management. Their primary shared objective was to enforce tributso, taxes paid in textiles, crops, or currency, and to ruthlessly manage the mita.
The Mita. Let's dig into this because you really cannot understand the religious history of the Andes without understanding this labor draft.
No, you can't. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the mita was originally an Inca concept. Before the Spanish arrived, the Inca state required subjects to provide rotational labor for public works.
Like building roads, terracing mountains, serving in the army.
Exactly. But it was reciprocal. The state provided massive feasts, beer, and security in exchange for that labor. The Spanish took that existing bureaucratic infrastructure, stripped away all the reciprocity, and weaponized it into a machine of mass extraction.
Just a one-way street of labor.
Completely. They used the mita to feed conscripted Andean labor directly into the silver mines of Potosí.
Located in the high altitudes of modern-day Bolivia, Potosí was nicknamed the mountain that eats men.
And it earned that name. It was one of the largest industrial complexes in the early modern world, and undeniably one of the deadliest. Potosí sits at over 13,000 feet above sea level. The air is incredibly thin, and the mining process the Spanish used relied heavily on mercury amalgamation.
Right, the patio process. So the conscripted workers, the matayos, they aren't just swinging pickaxes in the dark.
No, of course.
They are physically stomping on crushed silver ore mixed with highly toxic mercury bare-legged to separate the silver.
Men would wade into freezing vats of toxic slurry for hours, and the health effects were catastrophic. The mercury poisoning destroyed their nervous systems. The silicosis from the rock dust inside the shafts destroyed their lungs.
Not to mention the accidents.
Right, the sheer physical exhaustion of carrying massive sacks of ore up primitive, rickety ladders in pitch-black shafts led to endless fatal falls. The mortality rates were staggering. Entire generations of young men were swallowed by the mountain.
And the priest, sitting back in the Doctrina on his centralized grid, is the one auditing the parish registry to make sure the village meets its quota for this exact death march.
He is signing off on the conscription lists. This is the crucial context for the spiritual conquest. Evangelization and brutal economic extraction ran through the exact same office.
They were the same thing to the people experiencing it.
Exactly. To the Andeans, the Catholic Church and the silver mine were not separate entities. They were a single, crushing weight.
Put yourself in the shoes of an Andean farmer in 1580. The man standing at the altar telling you to confess your sins, telling you about the love and salvation of Jesus Christ, is the exact same man signing the paperwork that will send your teenage son on a 2-month walk to Potosí.
A walk from which he will likely return, crippled, coughing blood, or, just not return at all.
Under those material conditions, how do you embrace the theology of the colonizer? You can't. The entire apparatus of the church is actively dismantling your family and working your community to death.
So you comply. You go to Mass. You bow your head. You let the priest splash water on your child's forehead. But the heart of your belief system, the core of how you understand the universe, it retracts. It goes deeply, intentionally underground.
But there's a massive flaw in this system for the Spanish. If your local priest is also the guy sending you to a death camp in the mines, there is zero chance you're actually listening to his sermons. The Spanish had to realize their message wasn't penetrating the psychological armor of the Andeans, right?
Oh, they absolutely realized it. The Doctrina system was fundamentally an extractive administrative grid. As a spiritual grid, it was failing. The Spanish colonial administrators and church officials saw the superficial compliance.
They knew it was fake.
They knew. They realized that to actually control the Andean population, to truly overwrite their worldview and solidify the empire, they needed to get inside their heads. And to do that, they needed a much better communication strategy.
So if they realized Spanish wasn't working, what was the pivot? Did they just ship over more translators?
Well, the logistics of translation in a massive, rugged empire with dozens of distinct languages were incredibly complex. In other parts of the Americas, the approach varied wildly. In Mexico, missionaries often ended up prioritizing Spanish. Much later, in places like North America, we see brutal, systematic attempts to completely eradicate native tongues in boarding schools.
Yeah.
But the Andean church made a surprisingly pragmatic institutional pivot. In the early 1580s, the religious leadership convened the Third Council of Lima. Archbishop Toribio de Mogrovejo led a push to admit that trying to teach the intricacies of the Catholic Holy Trinity in Spanish to rural, traumatized farmers was a spectacular failure.
So they decided to meet the Andeans where they were linguistically.
They decided to standardize the local languages, specifically Quechua, which had been the administrative language of the Inca elite, and Aymara. They decided to use the languages of the conquered empire to spread the religion of the conquering empire.
That is a massive institutional undertaking. I mean, you have to codify a spoken language, create grammatical rules, and translate incredibly dense, abstract European theology into a completely different linguistic framework.
And it culminated in 1584 with a landmark technological and cultural event. They printed the Doctrina Christiana y Catecismo in Lima.
This was the very first book ever printed in South America, right?
Yeah, exactly. The church actually brought a printing press across the ocean specifically for this purpose. The book was a trilingual catechism, laid out side by side in Spanish, Quechua, and Aymara.
But the dossier emphasizes that this linguistic standardization is heavily debated by modern scholars. We shouldn't look at this just as a benevolent act of cultural preservation by the church.
Far from it. The church's decision kept Quechua and Aymara alive in print, which gave them an institutional anchor that many other indigenous languages never received. But the version of Quechua they created, what linguists call pastoral Quechua, was an artificial construct.
They steamrolled over all the regional diversity.
Right. Quechua wasn't a single monolithic block. It was a vibrant, shifting spectrum of regional dialects. The church stripped away that nuance, ironing out the vocabulary to create a uniform, utilitarian tool for conversion. They preserved the language by fundamentally altering its natural landscape.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because language refuses to be a sterile tool. Words are sticky, they carry historical baggage, cultural memories, and entire cosmologies inside them.
They absolutely do.
To explain Catholic abstractions, the Spanish priests had to dig into the Andean vocabulary. But those Andean words carried the old world with them.
You can't just hollow out a word and pour a new definition into it.
It's like trying to install a brand new operating system on a computer. You want the new OS to completely overwrite the old system. You want the Catholic interface. But to install it, you have to use the old original code. And because you're using the old code, the old programs just keep quietly running in the background.
That is a fantastic analogy.
The screen looks Spanish and Catholic,
Yeah.
but the backend server is still entirely Andean.
That analogy perfectly captures the phenomenon. The source materials provide fascinating, concrete examples of this linguistic trap. Let's look at the concept of God. When the priests needed a word for God, the singular, omnipotent, judgmental Catholic creator, they searched the Quechua vocabulary and selected Tichi Viracocha.
But Tichi Viracocha wasn't a blank slate waiting for Christian meaning. That was the name of the ancient Inca creator deity.
Exactly. So imagine the scene in the Doctrina. The priest is leading a prayer, demanding the congregation bow to Tichi Viracocha. The priest genuinely believes he's invoking the God of the Bible.
Right.
But the Andean person kneeling on the floor is hearing the name of the entity that formed the sun and the moon at Lake Titicaca. They are participating in a Catholic Mass. But the conceptual image firing in their neurons is deeply rooted in their own ancient cosmology.
Or take the concept of the Holy Spirit. I mean, how do you translate the Holy Spirit to someone whose spiritual world is tied to mountains and agriculture? The priests chose the Quechua word same.
Same translates roughly to breath, or an animating wind. In the Andean worldview, the landscape itself is alive, the mountains breathe, the earth has a pulse.
Right, it's animistic.
Yes. Same is the physical life force that animates the physical world. By using Same for the Holy Spirit, the priests accidentally grounded a deeply abstract Catholic concept into the tangible animistic reality of the Andes. The spiritual became physical.
It's a linguistic Trojan horse. The colonizers carried the ancient gods inside the walls of their own newly built churches. But the absolute best example of this, the one that really highlights the philosophical chasm between Europe and the Andes, is the translation of the word sin.
Sin is the fulcrum of the entire Catholic conversion project. You have to convince a population that they are inherently flawed, that they carry a moral stain, in order to offer them the exclusive cure of salvation.
The Spanish used the Quechua word hucha, but the dossier breaks down the etymology of hucha, and it has absolutely nothing to do with a moral offense against an angry creator.
Nothing at all.
Eh.
The Andean worldview does not have a concept of original sin. Their philosophy is entirely structured around reciprocal balance. Balance between human beings, balance with the harsh landscape, and balance with the ancestors. It is a system of mutual obligations.
So what did hucha actually mean to them?
Hucha didn't mean a stain on your immortal soul. Hucha meant a rupture of that cosmic reciprocal balance. It was a disruption in the fabric of the community. It meant you failed to meet an obligation to your neighbor. Or maybe you took too much from the mountain without offering something in return.
So when the Spanish priest stands at the pulpit and screams, "You must repent of your hucha to avoid the fires of hell," the Andean listener is processing a completely different directive.
Entirely different.
They are hearing, "You need to restore your communal balance. You need to go make an offering to the mountain you offended."
Exactly. The priest and the congregation are using the exact same vocabulary, but they are participating in two completely separate conceptual universes. The very instrument meant for complete conversion, the standardized translated catechism, became the vessel that carried Andean ways of thinking safely forward into the future.
It allowed their cosmology to hide in plain sight, embedded in the very prayers forced upon them.
The church was initially thrilled with their printed catechisms, thinking they had solved the conversion puzzle. But you can't hide a massive parallel religious system forever.
No, you can't.
Decades later, the illusion of the spiritual conquest shattered completely.
And the realization must have been terrifying for the colonial officials. By the early 1600s, colonial inspectors and priests started uncovering the physical evidence that the mass baptisms and the pristine attendance records at the Doctrina were just a total facade.
A performance.
The Andeans hadn't renounced their ancient beliefs at all. They had just moved their actual religious practices out of the sightlines of the Spanish grid.
And this discovery triggers one of the darkest, most visceral chapters in colonial history, the extirpation of idolatries.
Let's get into this because the sheer scale of the violence here is staggering.
And this is where we see a fundamental difference in the colonial strategies across the Americas.
Yeah.
In Mexico, during the early days of the conquest, you had Spanish priests famously toppling massive, visible pyramids in city centers.
Very visible destruction.
Right. But in the Andes, the sacred wasn't primarily an architectural structure. The sacred was the landscape itself.
The extirpators, men like the infamous Francisco de Avila, were deployed to hunt down huacas.
And a huaca could be a specific, unusually shaped rock formation. It could be a sacred spring. It could be a jagged mountain peak. The earth itself was imbued with spiritual power and required constant interaction and offerings. You can't just knock over a mountain.
But the extirpators weren't just hunting sacred rocks. They were hunting something much more intimate and crucial to the social fabric, right? The malkuis.
The mummified ancestral bodies.
We really need to pause and understand the malkuis because the Western conception of a mummy is, a dead body locked in a tomb, completely removed from the living world. But that is not how the Andeans viewed them at all.
Not even slightly. In the Andean tradition, death was not a sudden final severance from the community. It was a transition to a different state of being. The malkuis were the literal and spiritual center of the Ayala.
They were active participants.
Yes. They were active, participating members of the family. The living would consult them on major decisions, like when to plant crops or who to marry. They dressed them in fine textiles. They offered them food, and specifically chicha, the traditional fermented maize beer.
The families had taken these mummified ancestors and hidden them in remote caves, high up in the mountains, far away from the Doctrina. And they would sneak out under the cover of darkness, risking horrific punishment just to sit with their grandparents, change their clothes, and share a drink with them.
So when the Spanish launched these extirpation campaigns, it is not just a theological debate over abstract doctrine. It is a deeply intimate psychological violation of the family unit. The extirpators were hunting down the beloved elders of the community.
The methods documented in the dossier are pure systematic terror. The extirpators would ride into a village, accompanied by armed guards and a notary. They would issue an edict of grace, demanding everyone turn over their hidden idols.
And of course, the village would stay silent.
And when the village inevitably stayed silent, the torture began.
They would target the elders and the traditional religious specialists. They used the strappado, hoisting people up by their wrists, tied behind their backs, to force them to reveal the hidden locations of the huacas and the caves holding the melkis.
they forced public confessions, too.
Right, stripping people to the waist, putting ropes around their necks, and parading them through the grid towns as a public humiliation.
And the culmination of this terror was the auto de fe, the ritual of public punishment and execution. The visual details from the archives are just horrifying. Try to picture this. Thousands of sacred mummies, generations of carefully tended ancestors, are dragged out of their hidden caves.
Right.
They are thrown into a massive pile in the center of the village square, right in front of the Catholic Church. And while the entire community is forced to watch, the Spanish set the pile on fire.
The psychological trauma of watching your ancestors burn to ash is almost unfathomable. And the Spanish didn't stop there. When they found a stone huaca, they would shatter it. Then, to assert total dominance, they would force the indigenous laborers to use the shattered pieces of the sacred rock as masonry to build the walls of new Catholic chapels.
Wow.
They were physically capping the sacred Andean landscape with Christian mortar.
It is a complete scorched earth policy against the spiritual memory of the civilization. But the dossier offers a really profound analytical lens on this violence. The Spanish archives recorded these burnings as glorious victories over the devil. But from a historical perspective, this immense violence wasn't a sign of Spanish strength, it was an admission of ultimate defeat.
What's fascinating here is the timeline. The initial conquest of the Incas happened in the 1530s. The extirpation campaigns peak in the early 1600s.
Right?
You only launch a desperate, expensive, scorched earth campaign 70 years later if your initial strategy completely failed.
The sheer fact that thousands of mummies were available to be burned in 1615 proves that the spiritual conquest of the 1530s never actually happened.
Exactly. The extirpation wasn't a victory lap. It was a panicked reaction to the terrifying realization that Andean religion had successfully survived vibrantly and underground right under the noses of the priests for 3 generations. The violence was a reaction to indigenous resilience.
While the horror of the autos de fe is undeniable, we also have to read the colonial archives critically. When a Spanish priest writes back to Lima boasting that he personally destroyed 5,000 idols and burned 600 mummies in a single month, can we actually trust the scale of those numbers?
It is highly contested ground among historians. We must treat the statistical data in the extirpation archives with extreme caution. The men running these campaigns, like Francisco de Ávila, were ambitious careerists.
They were middle managers looking for a promotion.
They needed to prove their zeal. They needed to prove that the countryside was absolutely infested with devil worship to justify their massive budgets, their violent methods, and frankly, their own continued employment.
Right, if you don't find any idols, you don't have a job.
If an extirpator comes back and says, "I didn't find much," his career is over. So they were heavily incentivized to inflate the body counts of the ancestors and exaggerate the number of destroyed huacas. The violence was incredibly real, but the archives are also a form of colonial propaganda.
We have painted a really bleak landscape so far. Systemic violence in the reducciones, economic extortion and mass death in the silver mines, and the intimate psychological warfare of the extirpation campaigns. If you look at that environment, it seems impossible that anyone could fight back.
But they did.
Indigenous agency found a new, highly sophisticated weapon. Some Andeans decided not to hide in the caves. They decided to step into the light and fight the empire, using the empire's own specialized tools, literacy, the legal petition, and Catholic theology.
Which brings us to arguably the most powerful, complex, indigenous voice of the era, Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala.
Guaman Poma is a fascinating figure. He was an Andean noble, a native Quechua speaker, but he was also deeply embedded in the colonial system. He was bilingual, he worked as a translator for the Spanish clergy, and he was a devout Christian.
Right.
And around the year 1615, amidst the height of the extirpation campaigns, he finished a staggering work called El Primer Nueva Crónica y Buen Gobierno, the First New Chronicle and Good Government.
Calling it a work almost diminishes the physical reality of what he produced. This was a 1,200-page manuscript. It was a massive, heavy-bound book, written entirely by hand, addressed, and intended to be shipped across the Atlantic directly to King Philip III of Spain.
And what makes it a masterpiece isn't just the text. Embedded within those 1,200 pages are 398 detailed, full-page pen and ink drawings. These illustrations are an unprecedented visual record of colonial abuses, drawn directly from the perspective of the colonized.
Let's focus on what he actually drew, because the imagery is fearless. He didn't just draw abstract complaints. He drew the very people he worked with.
He named names.
He absolutely did. He sketched doctrineros, the parish priests, physically kicking pregnant indigenous women. He drew the Spanish corregidors extorting families, threatening to denounce them to the extricators if they didn't hand over their wealth. He meticulously, visually documented systemic corruption, sexual violence against Andean women, and massive land theft by the colonial administrators.
He was exposing the dark, rotten underbelly of the Doctrina system we talked about earlier. He was showing the King of Spain exactly what his glorious spiritual conquest actually looked like on the muddy, bloody ground of the Andes.
But Guaman Poma didn't just act as a journalist documenting horror. He engaged in a brilliant form of theological judo. He flipped the script on the Spanish.
He used his deep understanding of Christianity to create a subversive argument. He argued that the Andeans who were suffering, impoverished, and being persecuted by the extirpators were actually living closer to the teachings of Jesus Christ than the Spanish were.
And his most devastating critique was aimed directly at the extirpators. While the Spanish priests were obsessively hunting for malquis in hidden caves, accusing the Andeans of idolatry, Guaman Poma pointed out that the colonizers were the true fanatical idolaters.
Because of the silver.
Exactly.
Okay.
He wrote that the Spanish worshipped only one god, a god that made them commit horrific sins: gold.
It's incredible. He gathers hundreds of pages of evidence of corporate malfeasance, illustrates it beautifully, binds it together, and tries to send this massive whistleblower report straight to the CEO of a corrupt multinational empire.
A CEO who, tragically, almost certainly never saw it. The manuscript likely never reached the king's eyes. It vanished into the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the Spanish court.
But as we read Guaman Poma today, the dossier cautions us against viewing him purely as a selfless martyr for the common people. He was a complex political actor.
This raises an important question about how we read primary sources. We have to remember that this manuscript wasn't just a cry for help. It was a highly strategic political document with a specific agenda. Guaman Poma was an Andean noble who felt his rightful status had been usurped by corrupt Spanish administrators.
His proposed solution, his good government, wasn't to dismantle the Spanish Empire or return to the days of the Inca.
No, he wanted a management shakeup.
Right.
He argued that the corrupt Spanish officials and the abusive priests should be expelled from the Andes, and that the traditional Andean nobility, specifically people like himself, should be installed as the direct administrators, ruling the Andes faithfully under the overarching sovereignty of the Spanish crown.
He used the colonizers' language of Christian morality to make a political play for his own social class. Recognizing his ambition doesn't diminish the vital truth of the horrific abuses he documented, but it reminds us that Indigenous historical actors were sophisticated, strategic, and self-interested, just like anyone else.
And the survival of his manuscript is nothing short of miraculous. For nearly 300 years, this 1,200-page indictment was lost to history. It wasn't until 1908 that a researcher stumbled across it misfiled in the archives of the Royal Danish Library in Copenhagen.
And today, because of digitization, anyone listening to this can go online to the Royal Danish Library's website and scroll through Guaman Poma's 398 drawings. A document meant for a single king in 1615 is now a radically accessible testament to Indigenous resistance for the entire world.
Which brings us to the final fascinating arc of our deep dive. Guaman Poma sent his masterpiece into the void. The extirpation campaigns kept burning mummies. The Mita kept sending generations to die in the toxic shafts of Potosí. If you stop the timeline in the late 1600s, the colonial machinery seems to have won.
But the true vindication of Guaman Poma's resistance and the ultimate failure of the Spanish spiritual conquest didn't happen in a royal court. It happened 4 centuries later. And it happened inside the very colonial institutions built to eradicate the Andean mind.
If we fast forward to the Andes today, the reality is undeniable. The extirpation failed. The machinery of erasure broke down.
The survival of the languages is the most obvious proof.
Quechua and Aymara didn't just survive as dusty historical artifacts. They are vibrant, living, evolving languages spoken by millions of people across South America today. They are recognized as co-official languages in Peru and Bolivia.
And it's not just the words that survived.
No, the deep Andean cosmovision, that philosophy of reciprocal balance of hucha and Aini, and the reverence for Pachamama, the Earth Mother, haven't been paved over. They have been increasingly reclaimed and woven back into the political and public life of the region. Bolivia even restructured its constitution to become a plurinational state, officially recognizing its diverse indigenous nations.
But the dossier highlights one specific modern event that serves as the perfect poetic bookend to Guaman Poma's story. It happened just recently, 2019.
The story of scholar Roxana Quispe Collantes.
In 2019, Roxana Quispe Collantes achieved something entirely unprecedented in the centuries-long history of South American academia. She wrote and successfully defended a doctoral dissertation entirely in the Quechua language.
To fully appreciate the weight of this, you have to understand where she defended it. She didn't do this at a modern progressive cultural center. She defended her dissertation at the National University of San Marcos in Lima, Peru.
San Marcos is not just any university. It is the oldest university in the Americas. It was established in 1551 by a direct royal decree from the Spanish crown. It is the literal architectural and intellectual bedrock of the colonial establishment.
San Marcos was the institution designed to train the colonial elite. It was the intellectual engine that produced the theologians, the administrators, and the men who justified and ran the Doctrinas and the extirpation campaigns. It was built to institutionalize the Spanish worldview and exclude the Andean one.
And yet, 4.5 centuries later, Roxana Quispe Collantes stands inside the walls of that colonizer university. She is wearing traditional Andean clothing, and she spends hours defending a high-level academic thesis on Quechua literature, speaking the colonized language to a panel of judges.
And she didn't just pass.
No, the dossier notes she earned a score of 20 out of 20, the highest possible grade in the system.
The historical symmetry is profound. 400 years ago, Felipe Guaman Poma de Ayala took the Spanish alphabet, the colonizer's faith, and the format of a royal chronicle to beg a European king to acknowledge Andean humanity. He used their tools to ask for permission to exist.
And he was completely ignored by the system.
But 4 centuries later, Roxana Quispe Collantes took the highest echelon of the Western academic system, the PhD defense. And she didn't beg anyone for permission. She forced the colonial institution to listen to an Andean voice speaking Quechua entirely on its own intellectual terms. And she forced that institution to officially validate its supreme value.
She didn't just survive the academic machinery, she mastered it, turned it inside out, and made it validate her worldview in her own language.
It perfectly encapsulates the unbroken lineage of agency we've been tracking. From the translation of the catechisms that accidentally preserved ancient cosmological concepts, to the terrifying clandestine preservation of the Malquis in the face of the Spanish fires, to the masterful use of the written word by Guaman Poma, to Quispe's academic triumph, the resistance just changed its shape over the centuries.
We have covered a massive amount of historical terrain today. We started by looking at the Doctrina and the extirpation campaigns. These were massive, brutal institutional machines. They were designed to extract physical wealth from the mountains and entirely erase a native cosmos from the minds of the people.
They were designed to replace an ancient living reality with a rigid Spanish Catholic grid.
But history, as we've seen, refuses to stay neatly contained on the grid. Instead, the church's attempt to standardize the language to control the mind ended up smuggling the old gods into the new faith. And the brutal burning of the ancestors in the village squares, which was meant to permanently break the Andean spirit, only pushed the roots deeper underground where the colonizers couldn't reach them. So, what does this all mean for you?
Consider the immense power of adopting your opponent's tools without ever surrendering your own worldview. That is the core lesson of the Central Andes. Guaman Poma took the Spanish pen. Roxana Quispe took the Western PhD system. What does it mean for our modern understanding of history when the ultimate victory of the marginalized isn't achieved by destroying the colonizer's machinery, but by mastering it and using it to rebuild your own house?
It makes you wonder how many other completed conquests in our history books are actually just stories of cultures that learned how to expertly hide in plain sight, waiting for the right century to speak again. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the resilient heart of the Andes. Keep questioning the historical narratives you've been handed. They are rarely as clean or as final as they seem.